Motion 74, Cuba and the US blockade. General Council support the motion. It's going to be moved by the POA, seconded by Unite. Then I'll be calling the GMB and the National Education Union. Steve.
Congress, President Steve Gillen, POA. It is 10 years since the last motion on Cuba at Congress. A lot has changed since then. The Miami Five are free. Cuba and the US re-established diplomatic relations. President Obama was welcomed in Havana, and Cuba's new president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, met with British government ministers in London. All important and positive steps toward normalizing relations and helping the Cuban people develop their economy and society. However, the one thing that has not changed in those 10 years, and indeed the last 6 decades, is the US blockade. And let me remind you, Congress, of the impact of the blockade. It has cost the Cuban economy $933 billion. It's the longest sanctions imposed against any country in history. It is nothing short of economic warfare, which has caused massive suffering to the Cuban people. And despite 27 consecutive United Nations votes in condemnation, it still persists today. The blockade impacts on all sectors of Cuban society, their ability to access essential medicines and equipment, agriculture and industrial machinery, food, education supplies, household items. It impacts on everything. Either they can't get hold of what they need, or if they can, they have to go via third parties costing more money, up to a third more on transport costs alone. And it's extraterritorial. This means it impacts on Cuba's ability to trade with other countries, including us here in Britain. British banks and companies have been fined millions of dollars for financial transactions with Cuba. The Open University barred applications from Cuba students because they were worried they may be penalized. A policy, I'm glad to say, was overturned thanks to some of the brilliant campaigns by British trade unions, and in particular education unions, and the Cuba Solidarity Campaign in 2017. But these were policies that took place before Trump. Under Obama, who was supposed to be improving things, things have now got considerably worse. Trump has surrounded himself with the most pro-blockade and pro-intervention policy advisors in Cuba, and uses language of aggression not seen since the Cold War. He has tightened the blockade, banned cruise ships, and made travel to the island even more difficult for US citizens. He's all but closed the US embassy in Havana and made it impossible for Cubans to apply for visas to visit the US. Cuban trade unionists are barred from attending trade union conferences with sister unions in the US. State-run hotels have been blacklisted. Trump has reduced the money that Cuban Americans can send home to their families. And in May this year, the White House implemented Title III of the 1996 Helms-Burton Act. In doing so, it unleashed the most severe economic sanctions against Cuba since the blockade was first introduced in 1962. Title III enables Cuban Americans to launch lawsuits in US courts against foreign companies accused of trafficking in property nationalized after the revolution. This basically opens the door for Cubans who left after the revolution to sue any company with links to nationalized properties. 4 have already been filed, including one by the US multinational ExxonMobil, which has taken Cuba to court for $280 million for oil refineries and petrol stations nationalized in 1960. All of this is intended to scare foreign banks and companies from investing in or trading with Cuba in an effort to stifle the island's economy and development and keep the people in poverty, with a long-term goal of forcing regime change to install a government compliant to US interests. These are worrying times for Cuba, and solidarity is vital. Despite the blockade, Cuba has made world-renowned achievements in education, health, social welfare, women's representation, and international humanitarianism, including 400,000 medical volunteers in 165 countries since 1960, training 35,000 doctors from 138 countries since 1998, and the second highest number of women MPs in the world at 53.2%. These are achievements worth defending. I do not claim that Cuba is perfect. The Cuban people don't either. They know there is a lot they can improve on, but the country has achieved so much against the odds. Imagine what they could have achieved without the blockade. This is why, Congress, I urge you to support Motion 74 on the anniversary of the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Revolution and the 80th anniversary of the CTC by supporting Unions for Cuba Conference as well on the 2nd of November this year. I so move. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Call on Unite to second.
President, Congress, Jane Taylor from Unite, seconding motion 74. Conference, it's an honour to be seconding this motion in the 80th anniversary of the CTC and the 60th of the Cuban Revolution. My union, Unite, has a proud history of solidarity with Cuba. For example, Unite moved the motion in support of the Miami Five in Congress in 2008. And I'm proud of the role that British trade union movement played in the campaign for their freedom and the long-standing bonds of friendship that we've all maintained with Cuban workers. Unite and other unions will be hosting representatives from Cuba unions for a week of exchanges with British workers at the Unions for Cuba conference in November. I would urge those of you not already involved to support the Cuba Solidarity Campaign who are organising this event. The Cuban Revolution and the CTC not only prioritised the health and education of its own people, but through its inspirational internationalism has transformed the lives of millions of people across the world. These achievements are inspirational in themselves, but when you know they've been carried out by a small island with few natural resources or wealth in the face of a 57-year-old US blockade, they are quite staggering. Despite suffering the longest economic sanctions ever imposed against any country in history, Cuba resists. Its response to the US's aggressive and interventionist foreign policy is to forge one built on solidarity and internationalism and shows that another world is possible. The rich elites who left Cuba after the revolution in 1959 thought they would be back in a matter of months to reclaim their plantations, estates, and mansions. How wrong they were. They have never forgiven the people of Cuba for the revolution. Under President Donald Trump, the blockade has tightened to unprecedented levels. Congress, by supporting Motion 74, we will be sending a clear message to the Cuban people that they are not alone and cannot be isolated by the US policy of aggression. Please support the motion.
Thank you, Jane. Call on the GMB, then the NEU.
President, Congress, Lorraine Parker de Lazarete speaking in support of Motion 74 on behalf of the GMB. My unit is proud to stand in solidarity with the Cuban people who continue to fight the cruel economic blockade imposed upon them by the United States, a blockade that is now being tightened once again by Donald Trump. We also celebrate the achievements of the Cuban people in the face of such aggression, in particular their achievements in creating a more equal society. Congress, today women in Cuba hold over 70% of education and healthcare jobs. 60% of them are lawyers, 68 university graduates, 53% MPs, the second highest in the world. I can speak from personal experience how these achievements make such a difference to the lives of the Cuban people. After attending a trade union delegation to Cuba in 2012, I met and married my husband. Thank you, GMB. He now often says, thank you. He now often says, "You're more Cubana than me." Over time, I've seen how my stepdaughters and my grandson have benefited from Cuba's world-class schools. When my husband needed treatment in hospital, he was seen by a doctor on the Monday, a consultant on Tuesday, in hospital the next day, with a dedicated physio to look after him in recovery. It is amazing what a society that prioritizes looking after your fellow human beings can achieve in such hard times. The US blockade has cost $933 billion to the Cuban economy and still denies Cubans access to basic necessities and goods. Congress, international solidarity is not just about meetings and speeches, it's about something deeper than that. It's about working people, no matter what country we come from, all speaking the same language of hope and determination. When the actions of Donald Trump can cause such suffering across national boundaries, working people need to come together in every country and stand up for the values we share and oppose his policies. The rights we have gained through our trade union movement were never granted to them. We fought that for them, and now they're under attack again from Boris Johnson. The rights that the Cuban people won to create a better society free from imperialism and inequality were not granted to them either. They fought for them, and they are now under attack by Donald Trump. Trump wants to bully the world into shutting its doors to the Cuban people. Cuba will not stand for it, and neither should we. Please support the motion.
Thank you, Lorraine. And any you.
President Congress, trade unions unite people to campaign to fight for injustices. We must come together, unite together to organise to fight the impact and injustices of the blockade on the Cubans. We also come together to organise to grow in strength in our workplaces and our communities. By working with the Cubans, we can do this because we can learn so much from their successes. This is certainly the experiences we have in the NEU, the National Education Union. Because in our union we have a long and proud history of internationalism and solidarity with our friends in Cuba, our trade union friends in Cuba. This includes the vital link we have with the Cuban Teachers Union that we have hosted at our annual conference and we now have established through our annual delegations there, through sending our members to Cuba. This provides us with an invaluable experience in witnessing the impact of the blockade for ourselves, but it also enables us to witness the passion, commitment, political will and determination to provide a rich and fulfilling education from cradle to grave. It is notable how inspired our delegates are on their return, both as trade unionists and internationalists, but also as educators with a renewed passion for creative teaching. This inspirational education does not just happen by accident. It is because of that political will to make education a priority and the commitment of the highest percentage of GDP on education of any country. We must remember the blockade continues to have a demonstrable impact that impact is on obtaining the simplest of resources such as stationery, computers, science equipment. And that impact is only set to get worse with the Title III of the Helms-Burton Act. It could see pre-revolutionary owners of mansions and barracks and private buildings sue the Cuban state for converting them into public schools after the revolution. Members of the NEU have been able to offer practical solidarity, so we have run campaigns to send braille machines to special schools, and in April of this year we sent a shipment of 4,000 musical instruments over at the end of our annual conference. We were also proud to be part of that campaign that Steve talked about to end the Open University ban on Cuban students, working alongside other trade union colleagues. But it's also political solidarity that we must bring to bear, putting pressure on the US government to end the blockade. We need to step up this campaign in the face of new threats through our continued support of Cuba Solidarity Campaign and the support of this motion.
Thank you, Philippa. There being no opposition, move to the vote. All those in favour of motion 74? Thank you. Any against? That's carried. And Ulysses is still with us at the front, and I'm sure he'll take back to Cuba and his comrades the overwhelming support of of our conference.